The oil derrick stretched into the Texas sky like a steel prayer, but Victoria Ashford wasn't looking up anymore. She sat in the dust beside her Maserati, designer heels kicked off, watching the repo men load her last drilling equipment onto flatbed trucks. The irony wasn't lost on her. 24 hours ago, she'd owned 17 wells across 3 counties. Now she couldn't afford the gas to drive home. The courthouse steps had been cold that morning when Judge Morrison read the foreclosure order. Her father's empire, built on black gold and ruthless ambition, dissolved with the bang of a gavel. Victoria had bet everything on the Permian Basin expansion, leveraging assets her accountants warned her not to touch. The geological surveys had been wrong. The wells came up dry. The banks came calling. Hey, if you're watching this story unfold and feeling that pit in your stomach, you know that feeling when everything falls apart, smash that subscribe button right now because you're about to see something incredible. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and absolutely crush that hype button because what happens next will restore your faith in unexpected miracles. Trust me, you don't want to miss a single second of this. A shadow fell across her bare feet. Victoria looked up to see worn leather boots, faded jeans with honest dirt ground into the knees, and calloused hands that had never known manicures. The man attached to them couldn't have been much older than her 32 years, but his face carried the weathered map of someone who'd fought the land and lost more often than he'd won. "Ma'am, you can't stay here." His voice carried the slow drawl of East Texas, each word measured like water in drought season. "Sheriff's orders." Victoria laughed, the sound sharp and bitter in the afternoon heat. "Sheriff's orders, of course." She gestured at the convoy of trucks disappearing down the farm road. "They've taken everything else. Might as well take the dirt I'm sitting on too." The cowboy, because that's what he was, she could see it in the way he held himself, the careful distance he maintained from her car, the respect for property even when that property was being stripped away, shifted his weight. His hat cast his eyes in shadow, but she caught the flicker of something that might have been sympathy. "Name's Jake Malone. I work the Henderson Ranch, next section over." He paused, studying her face with the intensity of someone reading weather patterns. "Heard about your troubles." "My troubles?" Victoria stood, brushing dust from her silk blouse. The fabric was ruined anyway. Everything was ruined. "Is that what they're calling it? The complete annihilation of a family legacy?" Jake's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Depends on how you look at it, I reckon." She wanted to hate him for his calm, for the way he stood there like a monument to everything she'd never understood about this land. Her father had taught her to see Texas as a commodity, something to be extracted from and exploited. This man looked at it like it was alive, like it might have opinions about what happened on its surface. "You got somewhere to go?" The question came quietly, without judgment. Victoria's throat constricted. The penthouse in Dallas was gone. The beach house in Galveston seized. Her trust fund leveraged beyond recognition. Her friends, the ones who'd laughed at her charity galas and praised her business acumen, had stopped returning calls the moment the first bankruptcy filing hit the papers. "I'll figure something out." The lie tasted like copper pennies. Jake reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out a crumpled dollar bill. George Washington's face was nearly worn smooth, the paper soft as cloth from countless transactions. He held it out to her. Victoria stared at the money like it was a snake. "What is this?" "Down payment." "On what?" "Your services." The words hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that made Victoria's skin crawl. She'd heard the stories about what happened to women who fell this far, this fast, the desperation that led to choices that couldn't be undone. "I'm not," she started, but Jake was already shaking his head. "Henderson's got a bookkeeping problem. Numbers don't add up, hasn't for months. Previous accountant took off with half the ranch's operating capital." He nodded toward her car. "Figure someone who could build what you built might be able to sort out what's left." Victoria looked at the dollar bill again. It represented more money than she currently possessed, which was both pathetic and mathematically accurate. Her checking account had been frozen, her credit cards cancelled. The cash in her purse, exactly $37, wouldn't buy her a tank of gas. "You don't know anything about me," she said. "No, you graduated summa cum laude from UT Business School. No, you turned your daddy's 12 wells into 63 before the bottom fell out. No, you're sitting in the dirt in a $1,000 blouse because you believed in something enough to risk everything for it." Jake's eyes met hers, steady and grey as storm clouds. "That's more than most folks got." The repo trucks were disappearing over the horizon now, taking with them the last physical evidence of the Ashford Oil Company. Victoria felt something crack inside her chest, not breaking exactly, but shifting, like tectonic plates finding a new arrangement. She took the dollar. Jake's ranch sat in a valley between two low hills, the kind of landscape that looked deceptively simple until you understood the complexity of water rights and soil composition and the 100 other variables that determined whether cattle thrived or starved. The main house was a sprawling, single-story structure that had clearly been added onto over generations, each addition telling the story of a family's changing fortunes. The books were a disaster. Victoria spread the ledgers across the kitchen table, her laptop humming beside stacks of receipts that hadn't been properly categorized in months. Jake brought her coffee in a chipped mug that had probably been white once upon a time, now stained the color of weak tea. "Previous accountant was my ex-wife's cousin," Jake explained, settling into the chair across from her. "Should have known better than to mix family and business. Should have known better than to let someone without a CPA license handle your finances," Victoria muttered, scanning a particularly creative interpretation of equipment depreciation. "This is... Jesus, Jake. How are you still operating?" Carefully, she looked up from the laptop screen. Jake was watching her with that same steady intensity, but there was something else now. Wariness, maybe. Or hope. It was hard to tell the difference. "The good news is, you're not actually bankrupt," Victoria said. "The bad news is, you're about 6 weeks away from being bankrupt if these trends continue." Jake nodded like she'd confirmed something he already suspected. "What's the solution?" Victoria pulled up a spreadsheet, her fingers flying across the keyboard with the muscle memory of 1,000 similar analyses. Numbers had always made sense to her in a way that people didn't. They followed rules. They could be manipulated, optimized, made to tell the story you needed them to tell. "You're hemorrhaging money in 3 areas, she said, turning the laptop so he could see the screen. "Feed costs are 30% above market rate because you're buying from the same supplier your father used, even though there are better options. Your breeding program is producing calves with good genetics, but you're selling them at weaning instead of finishing them, which costs you about 40% of potential profit. And your land use is inefficient. You've got prime grazing sitting empty while you're overstocking the south pasture." Jake studied the numbers with the concentration of someone reading a foreign language. "How long would it take to fix?" "The feed supplier, we can change tomorrow. The land use, maybe 6 months to rotate the herds properly. The breeding program..." Victoria hesitated. "That's a 3-year commitment minimum, and it requires capital investment you might not have." "How much capital?" Victoria pulled up another spreadsheet, one that made her stomach clench. The numbers were significant, not by the standards of her former life, where she'd routinely approved million-dollar drilling operations, but by the standards of a ranch that was counting pennies. 80,000, spread over 18 months. Jake was quiet for a long time. Outside, Victoria could hear cattle lowing in the distance, a sound that was becoming familiar after 3 days of living in the ranch's guest room. It was a lonely sound, she thought, like a question being asked over and over without answer. "I don't have $80,000, Jake said finally. "I know, but you think it's worth doing anyway." Victoria closed the laptop. This was the moment she'd been dreading, the point where her professional assessment collided with the reality of Jake's situation. In her old life, she would have recommended he sell, cut his losses, find something more sustainable. But sitting in this kitchen, surrounded by the accumulated history of generations who'd worked this land, that advice felt like sacrilege. "I think this ranch could support 3 families if it was managed right," she said. "I think your great-grandfather knew what he was doing when he bought this particular piece of ground. I think the bones of something really good are here." But bones don't pay the bills." Jake stood and walked to the window that looked out over the south pasture. Victoria watched him, noting the way his shoulders carried tension like a physical weight. She'd seen that posture before, in the mirror during the final weeks before her empire collapsed. It was the stance of someone who'd run out of good options. "There might be another way," she said quietly. Jake turned back to her, eyebrows raised. "Partnership." The word hung between them like a bridge neither of them was sure they wanted to cross. Victoria felt her heart rate accelerate, the familiar rush of adrenaline that came with proposing a deal that could change everything. "I don't have money to invest," Jake said. "But you have land, and cattle, and infrastructure." Victoria opened the laptop again, pulling up a different set of calculations. "I have expertise and connections, and a very strong motivation to prove that my last business failure was an anomaly, not a pattern." "What kind of partnership?" Victoria had been thinking about this for 3 sleepless nights, staring at the ceiling of the guest room and listening to the sounds of a working ranch. It was a crazy idea, the kind of desperate gamble that had gotten her into trouble in the first place. But it was also the only idea that made her pulse quicken with something other than panic. 50-50 ownership. I handle all financial management, marketing and business development. You handle day-to-day operations, animal husbandry and land management. We implement the breeding program using a combination of traditional bank financing and private investors I still have relationships with. And if it fails," Victoria met his eyes, "then we both lose everything." Again. The silence stretched between them, filled with the weight of 2 people who'd already learned how much losing everything could cost. Victoria found herself studying Jake's face, looking for tells the way she used to read potential business partners. But Jake wasn't like the oil executives and investment bankers she was used to dealing with. His expressions were harder to read, more honest somehow. "Why?" he asked finally. "Why what? Why would you want to tie your future to a failing ranch and a cowboy you met 3 days ago?" It was a fair question, one Victoria had been asking herself. The rational answer was that she needed a place to rebuild, and this ranch represented her best opportunity to prove she could still turn a business around. But sitting in Jake's kitchen, surrounded by the evidence of his family's century-long relationship with this land, she suspected the real answer was more complicated, because I've spent my entire adult life extracting value from Texas, she said. Maybe it's time I tried to create some instead. Jake studied her for a long moment, then extended his hand. Partners. Victoria shook it, noting the calluses against her palm, the strength in his grip. Partners. The first month was harder than either of them had anticipated. Victoria's contacts in the financial world were willing to take her calls, but convincing them to invest in a cattle ranch required a level of salesmanship she hadn't needed since her early days building Ashford Oil. Jake, meanwhile, struggled with the transition from sole proprietor to partner, especially when Victoria's suggestions challenged methods his family had used for generations. The breaking point came on a Tuesday morning in October, when Victoria found Jake in the barn, staring at a cow that was clearly in distress. The animal was lying on her side, breathing heavily, her eyes rolled back in a way that suggested serious complications. "How long has she been like this?" Victoria asked. Since about 4 this morning. Jake's voice was tight with frustration. It's a breech berth. Calf's positioned wrong. Victoria had grown up around oil derricks, not livestock, but she could recognize a crisis when she saw one. What do? We call the vet. Again. Jake pulled out his phone, then stopped. Except Dr. Martinez is already dealing with an emergency at the Patterson place, and Dr. Williams is in surgery until this afternoon. So we wait, and hope she doesn't die before help arrives. Victoria looked at the cow, then at Jake's face. She'd seen that expression before, in her own mirror during the final days of Ashford Oil. It was the look of someone watching something precious slip away while feeling powerless to stop it. There has to be something we can do. Jake shook his head. I'm not a vet. I try to help with a breech berth. I could kill both the cow and the calf. But if we don't try, they die anyway. Jake's voice cracked slightly. This is Bessie. She's been on this ranch for 8 years. She's had 6 healthy calves. He stopped, running a hand through his hair. She's family. Victoria felt something shift inside her chest, a recognition of the weight Jake carried every day. This wasn't just business to him. These animals weren't assets on a balance sheet. They were individuals with histories and personalities and value that couldn't be measured in dollars. Teach me, she said. Jake looked at her like she'd suggested they perform brain surgery. What? You said you're not a vet, but you've been around cattle your whole life. You must have seen this before. Victoria knelt beside the cow, placing a gentle hand on her flank. Walk me through what needs to happen. Victoria, this isn't... Jake. She looked up at him, and for the first time since they'd shaken hands on their partnership, she let him see past the professional facade she'd been maintaining. I've lost everything I thought mattered. I'm not going to stand here and watch you lose something that actually does matter because I was too scared to try. Jake stared at her for a long moment, then knelt beside her. Okay, but if this goes wrong, it goes wrong. But at least we tried. What followed was the longest hour of Victoria's life. Under Jake's careful instruction, she learned to read the subtle signs of bovine distress, to understand the mechanics of birth when everything went sideways. Her hands, soft from years of office work, became tools for saving lives. When the calf finally emerged, alive, breathing, perfect, Victoria felt something she hadn't experienced since childhood. The pure joy of creation rather than extraction. Jake was looking at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. You did good, partner. The word hit her differently this time. Not just a business arrangement, but something deeper. A recognition that they were building something together, something that mattered in ways that had nothing to do with profit margins. We did good, she corrected. That evening, they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the hills in shades of gold and amber. Victoria had showered and changed clothes, but she could still feel the phantom weight of new life in her hands. It was a sensation she wanted to hold on to. Can I ask you something? Jake said. Shoot. What really happened with your company? I mean, I know the official story. Bad investment, market downturn, leveraged too heavily. But what really happened? Victoria was quiet for a long time, watching the last light fade from the sky. She'd told the sanitized version of her downfall so many times it had started to feel like truth. But sitting here, with the taste of honest work still fresh in her mouth, she found herself wanting to tell the real story. I stopped listening, she said finally. To who? To everyone. My geologists, my accountants, my gut instinct. I was so convinced I could see patterns that other people missed, so sure that my success was proof of some special insight. Victoria pulled her knees up to her chest. The Permian Basin expansion was supposed to be my masterpiece. 60 new wells across 3 counties, all based on geological surveys that showed massive untapped reserves. But the surveys were wrong. The surveys were fine. The geology was exactly what they said it was. Victoria's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. But I was reading 5-year-old data. The reserves had been tapped by other companies while I was busy congratulating myself on finding them. Jake absorbed this in silence. Victoria braced herself for judgment, for the kind of professional disgust she'd seen in the eyes of former colleagues. Instead, Jake asked, "How long did it take you to realize?" "About 30 seconds after the first well came up dry. But by then, I'd already committed to the full drilling program. 60 wells, Jake. 60 holes in the ground that produced nothing but debt and humiliation. So you kept going anyway." "I kept going anyway, because admitting I was wrong would have meant admitting that everything I'd built was based on luck rather than skill." Victoria laughed bitterly. "Turns out the market doesn't care about your ego." Jake was quiet for a moment, then said, "You know what I think?" "What?" "I think you're the first person who's ever sat on this porch and told me the truth about failing." Victoria looked at him, surprised. "What do you mean?" "Most folks, when they lose big, they either pretend it never happened or they turn it into a story about how the world screwed them over. You're the first person I've met who can look at a mistake and call it what it is without making excuses. I'm not sure that's a virtue. It is, if you're trying to build something new." They sat in comfortable silence as full darkness settled over the ranch. Victoria found herself thinking about the cow and calf, safe now in the barn, about the spreadsheets on her laptop, full of projections and possibilities, about the way Jake's hands had guided hers through the process of bringing life into the world. "Jake? Yeah? Thank you. For the dollar, I mean. For taking a chance on someone you had every reason not to trust." Jake turned to look at her, his face barely visible in the starlight. "Victoria? Yeah? Best dollar I ever spent. Nah." The winter brought challenges neither of them had anticipated. A late freeze damaged the winter wheat crop they'd planted as supplemental cattle feed. 2 of their best breeding bulls came down with a respiratory infection that required expensive veterinary treatment. The private investors Victoria had courted proved more cautious than expected, extending the timeline for securing the capital they needed for the breeding program expansion. But there were victories too. The feed cost savings Victoria had projected proved conservative. They were actually saving 40% by switching suppliers. The land rotation program was showing early signs of success, with grass quality improving in the previously overstocked areas. Most importantly, the partnership itself was working in ways that surprised them both. Victoria discovered she had an intuitive understanding of cattle behavior that complemented her analytical skills. Jake, meanwhile, proved to have a strategic mind that had been underutilized in his previous role as sole operator. Together, they developed systems that neither could have created alone. The real test came in February, when a winter storm knocked out power to the ranch for 3 days. Victoria, who'd never lived without climate control and reliable electricity, found herself learning to manage livestock in conditions that would have sent her running 6 months earlier. She and Jake worked 18-hour days, breaking ice on water troughs, hauling hay through knee-deep snow, checking on cattle that had taken shelter in whatever windbreaks they could find. On the second night, huddled in the kitchen beside a wood-burning stove that provided the only heat in the house, Victoria realized something had fundamentally changed. Not just in her circumstances, but in her understanding of what constituted a meaningful life. "I used to think success meant never having to worry about things like this," she said, gesturing at the oil lamps that provided their only light. Jake looked up from the ranch ledger he was updating by lamplight. "What do you think it means now?" Victoria considered the question while listening to the wind howl outside. "I think it means being able to handle things like this without falling apart." "You're not falling apart." "No," Victoria said, surprised by the realization. "I'm not." The power came back on the 3rd day, but something had shifted between them during those hours of shared crisis. They worked with an efficiency that spoke of deep familiarity, anticipating each other's needs and movements. When Jake reached for a tool, Victoria was already handing it to him. When Victoria needed help lifting something heavy, Jake was there before she asked. It was during the spring carving season that Victoria finally understood what Jake had meant about family. She'd been checking the pregnant cows every few hours, a routine that had become second nature over the winter months. But when she found Daisy, one of their younger heifers, in active labor with obvious complications, her first instinct wasn't to call Jake. It was to roll up her sleeves and get to work. The birth was difficult but successful, and when Victoria finally stood up, covered in mud and blood and utterly exhausted, she found Jake watching her from the barn doorway. "How long have you been standing there?" she asked. "Long enough to see you handle that like you've been doing it your whole life." Victoria looked down at the calf, now nursing contentedly while its mother licked it clean. "I never thought I'd care about anything the way I cared about oil wells, but this," she gestured at the scene before them, "this feels different." "How so?" "With oil, I was always taking something out of the ground. Here, I'm putting something into the world." Jake stepped into the stall, running a practiced hand over the calf to check for any problems Victoria might have missed. "You know what I realized watching you just now?" "What?" "You're not the same person who showed up here 8 months ago." Victoria considered this. He was right, of course. The woman who'd sat in the dust beside her repossessed Maserati would never have spent a night in a freezing barn helping an animal give birth. That woman had measured her worth in stock prices and quarterly reports. This woman measured it in the health of cattle and the quality of grass, and the satisfaction of work that left her physically exhausted but emotionally fulfilled. "Neither are you," she said. Jake raised an eyebrow. "How do you figure?" "The man I met 8 months ago was running a failing ranch and too proud to ask for help. This man is building something sustainable, something that'll last." They stood in comfortable silence, watching the calf explore its new world on unsteady legs. Victoria felt a contentment she'd never experienced in her previous life, a sense of being exactly where she belonged. "Jake?" "Yeah?" "I want to buy out your half of the ranch." Jake went very still. "What?" Victoria realized how that had sounded and quickly clarified. "I mean, I want to make this permanent, legal. Not just a handshake partnership, but a real business structure that protects both of us. You want to incorporate. I want to make sure that what we're building here can't be taken away by banks or lawyers or bad luck." Victoria turned to face him fully. "I want to make sure we're both protected." Jake studied her face with that same intensity she'd noticed the first day they met. "What kind of structure are you thinking?" "Equal partnership. Legally documented. Shared ownership of all assets, shared responsibility for all debts. If one of us wants out, the other has first right of refusal at fair market value." Victoria paused. "And I want to put in writing that this ranch stays a ranch. No matter what happens to oil prices or real estate markets or any other external factors. You'd give up the right to sell to developers. We'd both give up that right. This land has been in your family for 4 generations, Jake. It should stay that way for 4 more. Jake was quiet for a long time, and Victoria found herself holding her breath. She'd been thinking about this proposal for weeks, but saying it out loud made her realize how much it mattered to her. This ranch had become more than a business opportunity. It had become home. "There's something I need to tell you first," Jake said finally. Victoria's stomach clenched. "What?" "The ranch isn't just mine. Technically, I own it jointly with my ex-wife. The divorce decree gave me operational control, but she retained a 25% ownership stake." Victoria felt the bottom drop out of her world. "Why didn't you tell me this before?" "Because she hasn't been involved in ranch operations for 3 years. Because she lives in Houston and has never shown any interest in coming back. Because I didn't think it mattered." Jake's voice was defensive, but Victoria could hear the uncertainty underneath. It doesn't change anything between us. It changes everything between us. Victoria stepped back, her mind racing through the legal implications. Jake, if she decides she wants to sell her stake, or if she objects to the partnership structure, or if she just decides to make trouble, she won't. You don't know that. I know her. Sarah wants nothing to do with ranch life. She made that clear when she left. Victoria wanted to believe him, but her experience with family business disputes made her cautious. What exactly does the divorce decree say about her ownership rights? Jake's hesitation told her everything she needed to know. I'd have to look at the paperwork. Jake. Victoria's voice was carefully controlled. Please tell me you've read the divorce decree. Of course I've read it. It's been 3 years. I don't remember every detail. Victoria closed her eyes, feeling the familiar weight of a situation spinning beyond her control. We need to see those papers. Tonight. A day. The divorce decree was worse than Victoria had feared. Sarah Malone retained not just ownership rights, but also approval authority over any major business decisions, including partnerships, significant capital investments, or changes to the ranch's operational structure. In other words, everything Victoria and Jake had been planning required Sarah's consent. This is a disaster, Victoria said, spreading the legal documents across the kitchen table. Jake sat across from her, his face pale in the lamplight. Maybe we can work around it. Work around it how? Jake, according to this, she could block our breeding program expansion. She could force a sale of the ranch. She could dissolve our partnership on a whim. Victoria rubbed her temples, feeling a headache building. Why would you agree to these terms? Because I was 28 years old and heartbroken, and I just wanted the divorce to be over. Jake's voice was raw with frustration. Because my lawyer said it was standard language and I trusted him. Because I never thought I'd want to bring in a partner. Victoria stared at the papers, looking for loopholes that didn't exist. The language was ironclad, clearly written by someone who understood exactly how to protect Sarah's interests while giving Jake just enough operational control to keep the ranch running. We have to call her, Victoria said finally. What? We have to call Sarah and explain the situation. Maybe she'll be reasonable. Jake shook his head. You don't understand. Sarah hates everything about this place. She spent 5 years trying to convince me to sell and move to Dallas. The only reason she kept an ownership stake was to spite me. Then we buy her out. With what money? We're still 6 months away from securing the capital for the breeding program. We don't have the resources to buy out a 25% stake in a ranch this size. Victoria felt the walls closing in around her, the familiar sensation of a carefully constructed plan collapsing under the weight of unforeseen complications. But this time, instead of panic, she felt something else. Determination. Then we make her an offer she can't refuse. Jake looked at her skeptically. What kind of offer? Victoria pulled out her laptop and began typing, her fingers flying across the keyboard as she built a new set of projections. We show her what this ranch could be worth in 5 years if we implement our full development plan. We offer her a choice. Sell us her stake now for fair market value, or keep her ownership and watch her investment triple. And if she chooses option 2, then we make sure she has a very good reason to stay out of our way. Victoria worked through the night, building a presentation that would have impressed the most demanding venture capitalists. She included detailed financial projections, market analysis, risk assessments, and implementation timelines. But more than that, she included something she'd never put in a business proposal before: passion. She wrote about the satisfaction of sustainable agriculture, about the importance of preserving family ranches in an era of corporate consolidation, about the joy of working with animals and land in ways that honored both. She wrote about partnership and trust, and the kind of success that couldn't be measured purely in financial terms. When Jake read the finished proposal, his eyes were bright with something that might have been tears. "This is beautiful," he said. "But will it work?" "I don't know," Victoria admitted, "but it's the truth, and sometimes the truth is enough." They called Sarah the next morning. Victoria had prepared herself for hostility, for the kind of bitter ex-wife dynamics that could poison any negotiation. What she wasn't prepared for was the woman who answered the phone. Sarah Malone sounded tired, not just physically tired, but emotionally exhausted in a way that Victoria recognized from her own recent experience with loss. When Jake explained the situation and asked if they could meet to discuss the ranch's future, Sarah's response surprised them both. "I've been wondering when you'd call about this." "You have?" Jake asked. "Jake, I'm not stupid. I know you've been making improvements to the ranch. I know you brought in a partner. I know you're planning something bigger than just maintaining the status quo." Sarah's voice carried a weary resignation. "I've been waiting for you to ask me what I want." Victoria and Jake exchanged glances. This wasn't the conversation either of them had expected. "What do you want?" Victoria asked. There was a long pause before Sarah answered. "I want to not have to think about that ranch anymore. I want to not wake up in the middle of the night wondering if you're going to default on the property taxes and leave me holding the bag. I want to move on with my life." "Then let's talk," Victoria said. They met at a coffee shop in Austin, neutral territory that didn't carry the emotional weight of either the ranch or Sarah's new life in Houston. Victoria had expected to dislike Jake's ex-wife on principle, but the woman who walked into the coffee shop was nothing like the bitter adversary she'd imagined. Sarah Malone was beautiful in the way that Texas women often were. Strong-boned and sun-touched, with eyes that had seen enough of life to be kind without being naive. She greeted Jake with the careful courtesy of people who'd once loved each other and were now trying to figure out how to be strangers. "You must be Victoria," Sarah said, extending a hand. "I've heard a lot about you." "All good, I hope." Sarah smiled, and Victoria caught a glimpse of what Jake must have fallen in love with. Jake doesn't talk about people unless they matter to him. The fact that he talks about you at all tells me everything I need to know. They settled into a corner booth, and Victoria spread her presentation materials across the table. But before she could launch into her carefully prepared pitch, Sarah held up a hand. "Before we talk business, I need to say something." Sarah looked directly at Jake. "I'm sorry." Jake blinked in surprise. "For what?" "For the divorce terms. For making things complicated. For holding on to that ownership stake out of spite instead of just walking away clean." Sarah's voice was steady, but Victoria could see the effort it cost her. "I was hurt and angry, and I wanted you to hurt too. That wasn't fair." Jake was quiet for a moment, then said, "I'm sorry too, for not understanding what you needed. For choosing the ranch over our marriage." "You didn't choose the ranch over our marriage, Jake. You chose yourself over our marriage. And that was the right choice, even if it hurt at the time." Victoria felt like she was witnessing something intensely private, a conversation that had been 3 years in the making. She started to excuse herself, but Sarah shook her head. "Stay. This affects you too." Sarah turned back to Jake. "I've been thinking a lot about what went wrong between us, and I realized that I was trying to make you into someone you weren't. I wanted you to want the same things I wanted: city life, corporate success, financial security that didn't depend on weather and cattle prices. But that's not who you are." "No," Jake agreed quietly. "It's not. And from what I can see, Victoria understands that in a way I never did." Sarah looked at Victoria with something that might have been gratitude. "She's not trying to change you. She's trying to help you become more yourself." Victoria felt heat rise in her cheeks. "Sarah, It's okay. I'm not bitter about it. Actually, I'm relieved." Sarah pulled a folder from her purse and set it on the table. "Which brings me to why I agreed to this meeting. Victoria opened the folder to find legal documents that made her heart race. What is this? A quitclaim deed transferring my ownership stake in the ranch to Jake, effective immediately. No payment required. Jake stared at the papers like they might disappear if he looked away. Sarah, you can't just... I can, and I am. That ranch was never mine, Jake. It was yours and your father's and your grandfather's. I was just a temporary visitor who overstayed her welcome. But the financial value... Will you stop thinking about money for 5 minutes? Sarah's voice carried a hint of the exasperation that had probably characterized their marriage. I don't need your money, Jake. I have a good job, a nice apartment, a life that makes me happy. What I need is to not be tied to a past that neither of us can change. Victoria studied the documents, looking for catches or conditions that might complicate things later. But the language was straightforward, a complete transfer of ownership with no strings attached. Why now? Victoria asked. Sarah was quiet for a moment, then said, Because I've been watching from a distance, and I can see that you two are building something real, something that honors what that land is supposed to be, and because... She hesitated, then continued, because I'm getting remarried next month, and I want to start that new chapter without any unfinished business from the old one. Jake's face went through a series of expressions: surprise, hurt, acceptance, and finally something that looked like relief. Congratulations. Thank you. Sarah reached across the table and squeezed his hand briefly. He's a good man, Jake. Different from you, but good in his own way. He makes me happy in ways I didn't know I needed. Victoria felt something loosen in her chest, a tension she hadn't realized she'd been carrying. The legal complications that had threatened to destroy everything they'd built were dissolving. But more than that, she was witnessing a kind of grace she'd rarely seen in business or personal relationships. There is one condition, Sarah said, and Victoria's stomach clenched again. I want to come to the ranch one more time, to say goodbye properly. Jake nodded. Of course. And I want to meet the cattle. Victoria blinked in surprise. The cattle? Sarah laughed, the first genuinely happy sound she'd made since arriving. Jake used to talk about them like they were people. I always thought he was exaggerating, but now I'm curious. I want to see what I was competing with all those years. The visit happened the following weekend. Victoria watched nervously as Sarah walked through the pastures, observing the cattle with the careful attention of someone trying to understand a foreign language. Jake pointed out individual animals, sharing their histories and personalities with the same pride other men might show when discussing their children. That's Bessie, he said, indicating the cow Victoria had helped deliver months earlier. Victoria saved her life during a difficult birth. Sarah looked at Victoria with new respect. You delivered a calf. Jake talked me through it. I was terrified the whole time, but you did it anyway. I did it anyway. Sarah nodded slowly, as if confirming something she'd suspected. I could never have done that. The blood, the mess, the responsibility for another life. It would have paralyzed me. They walked in comfortable silence for a while, 3 people who'd found a way to navigate the complicated geography of past relationships and future possibilities. When they reached the barn where Victoria and Jake had spent so many early mornings working together, Sarah stopped. I can see why you love this place, she said to Jake. I never could before, but I can now. What changed? Jake asked. Sarah considered the question while watching a group of calves play in the afternoon sun. I think I had to figure out who I was before I could understand who you were. When we were married, I was so focused on who I thought I should be that I couldn't appreciate who you actually were. Victoria felt a pang of recognition. She'd spent years trying to be the person she thought success required, ruthless, focused, willing to sacrifice anything for the next deal. It had taken losing everything to discover who she actually was underneath all that ambition. I understand that, Victoria said quietly. Sarah smiled at her. I thought you might. As the sun began to set, they gathered on the porch, where Victoria and Jake had shared so many evening conversations. Sarah signed the quitclaim deed with a fountain pen that had belonged to her grandmother, a gesture that felt appropriately ceremonial for the moment. "There," she said, handing the papers to Jake. "It's all yours now, both of you." Jake looked at the deed, then at Victoria, then back at Sarah. "I don't know how to thank you." "Take care of it," Sarah said simply. "Take care of each other. Build something beautiful." After Sarah left, Victoria and Jake sat on the porch in the gathering darkness, processing the magnitude of what had just happened. The ranch was theirs now, free and clear of any external complications. They could move forward with their plans without looking over their shoulders. "I can't believe she just gave it to us," Jake said. "She didn't give it to us," Victoria corrected. "She gave it back to you. There's a difference." Jake was quiet for a moment, then said, "What do we do now?" Victoria pulled out her phone and scrolled to a contact she hadn't called in months. "Now we call my investors and tell them we're ready to move forward with the breeding program." "Tonight?" "Tonight. Sarah was right. We're building something beautiful, and I want to start building it right now." The call to her primary investor contact went better than Victoria had dared to hope. The combination of clear ownership, detailed business plans, and demonstrated operational success over the past year made their proposal attractive in ways that surprised even Victoria. By the end of the conversation, they had a commitment for the full $80,000 they needed, plus an additional credit line for unexpected expenses. "We did it," Victoria said, hanging up the phone. "We actually did it." Jake was looking at her with an expression she'd never seen before, pride mixed with something deeper, something that made her heart race in ways that had nothing to do with business success. "We make a good team," he said. "We do." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars emerge in the clear Texas sky. Victoria found herself thinking about the journey that had brought her to this moment, the spectacular failure that had seemed like the end of everything, the dollar bill that had started it all, the gradual discovery that success could be measured in ways she'd never considered. "Jake?" "Yeah, I need to tell you something." Victoria turned to face him, her heart pounding with a different kind of nervousness than she'd felt during any business negotiation. "I think I'm falling in love with you." The words hung in the air between them, honest and vulnerable, in a way that made Victoria feel simultaneously terrified and liberated. She'd spent so many years calculating every word, every gesture, every emotion for maximum strategic advantage. But sitting here on this porch, surrounded by the evidence of what they'd built together, she found herself incapable of anything but truth. Jake was very still for a moment, then reached out and took her hand. "I think I fell in love with you the day you delivered Bessie's calf. Why didn't you say anything?" "Because I was scared. Because my track record with relationships isn't exactly stellar. Because I didn't want to complicate what we had professionally." Jake's thumb traced circles on the back of her hand. "Because I've never met anyone who understood this place the way you do. And I was afraid of losing that." Victoria felt tears prick at her eyes, but they were good tears, the kind that came from relief rather than sorrow. "You're not going to lose me, Jake. I'm exactly where I want to be. Even though this isn't the life you planned." Victoria looked out over the ranch, their ranch, taking in the familiar shapes of cattle in the moonlight, the barn where they'd shared so many early mornings, the pastures where they'd learned to work as a team. "Especially because this isn't the life I planned." Jake leaned over and kissed her, soft and tentative at first, then with growing confidence as Victoria kissed him back. It was a kiss that tasted like possibility, like the promise of a future neither of them could have imagined a year ago. When they finally broke apart, Victoria rested her forehead against Jake's, breathing in the scent of hay and honest work that had become the perfume of home. "So what happens now?" she asked. "Now we build something that lasts," Jake said. Together. Victoria smiled, thinking about the breeding program they would implement, the sustainable practices they would develop, the legacy they would create for future generations. But more than that, she thought about the partnership they had forged, not just in business, but in life. Together, she agreed. The stars wheeled overhead, ancient and constant, bearing witness to another chapter in the long story of this land. And for the first time in her adult life, Victoria Ashford felt like she was exactly where she belonged. As you've watched this story unfold from corporate collapse to unexpected love, from a single dollar to a thriving partnership, maybe you've recognized something of your own journey in Victoria and Jake's transformation. Sometimes the greatest failures become the foundation for the most meaningful successes, and sometimes the people who save us are the ones we never saw coming. Their story reminds us that home isn't always where we start. Sometimes it's where we choose to rebuild, one honest day at a time.